Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our Ask About the Vax Q&A session. This session is being recorded, so we can share a link with all of you in the coming days, and we'll remove names from the recording, but it also may be shared externally as well with our community and media partners. So I just want to give everyone on the call a heads up about that. Today we have Dr. Shalika Katugaha here with us. She's a board certified and fellowship trained infectious disease specialist, and she's the director of infectious diseases here at Baptist Health. So she goes by Dr. K. So thanks for joining us today, Dr. K. And I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself to those who are on the call.
Thank you so much, Leslie. So I'm Dr. Katugaha, Dr. K. I know many of you now from the past webinar, from emails, and from the floors. So since my last webinar a week ago, I've gotten so many emails asking questions and reaching out. So I love that. So please keep doing that and sending me more. If I haven't responded yet, it's only because I'm giving each email a thorough and thoughtful response. So please keep doing that and reaching out. So today we are going to talk about vaccines, delivery, and development. And this is one of my favorite topics. And in fact, people ask me all the time why I went into infectious diseases. And I went into infectious diseases because I like fighting the good fight against viruses and bacteria. I find that very interesting and exciting. So as horrific as COVID-19 has been, one exciting bright light for scientists and ID doctors and researchers have been these mRNA vaccines. mRNA vaccines have been a long-standing ambition of scientists, and they've been around since the 1990s. So I'm going to explain what they are. We're going to do a little bit of the basics first, but I think that'll really help us understand and move forward. So how do vaccines work in general? So all vaccines of the past that are not mRNA, the way they worked is that scientists would grow a virus or bacteria in cell culture, and then they'd take a part of it, a protein part that was either harmless or inactivated. So they take part of that virus or bacteria, put it in a vaccine, and inject it in you. So it's perfectly safe. These are harmless proteins and only part of the thing, the bacteria or the virus. And then your body would develop an immune response, which would protect you when you actually see the real virus or the real bacteria. So how are mRNAs different and what do they do? So I have a picture here, and I hope you all can see it. And excuse the drawings, there we go. So here is the human cell, okay, the blue one. And you have a little bit of DNA in here. And what DNA does is it creates mRNA, which is messenger RNA, and that's what it is. It's a messenger. It creates genetic instructions to make a protein, and then the proteins do what they have to do to keep the cell alive. So that's the DNA. So now here we have COVID. There's a virus, and there are these spike proteins. So what did scientists do? They actually made the genetic code of the spike protein. So this is the genetic code for the spike protein, and they put it in these lipid nanoparticles, packaged it in a vaccine, and then they send it into your cell. So here it is. Here's the genetic code entering your cells. The genetic code undergoes protein translation and makes these spike proteins. So now the body has these spike proteins, so not the whole virus, just the spike protein, and the antibodies recognize it, and the antibodies begin to develop a defense, an immune response. So some of the myths I hear about the vaccine, does this mRNA enter DNA? So absolutely not. The mRNA comes, does its own thing, does not enter the DNA. So the other thing I've heard is, do these vaccines use fetal tissue, or do things grow in fetal tissues? So definitely not with mRNAs. You might say that even, in vaccines of the past, when they had to, not of the past, there's so many vaccines, but other vaccines, you have to grow bacteria or grow viruses in cell cultures. Here you don't. It's actually a mRNA genetic code. So you're not growing anything in cell tissue and fetal tissue, none of that. This is just a bit of genetic information. So this is very exciting. And so what are the advantages of this technology? Well, mRNA vaccines, they were fast and cheap. So perfect for the pandemic. Easy to develop, cheap. So unlike the other types of vaccines where you have to grow something and it takes time, you have to grow the bacteria, you have to grow the virus. Actually, with these, you don't have to grow anything, which is what makes them quicker. And then scientists, they use this process, which is actually called plug and play, to play around with the genetic sequence. They enjoy, and this is their life work. They make these genetic sequences and they play around with it, which is why this technology is so great for variants. So when these bacteria think they're winning the fight, actually scientists and researchers are trying to outsmart them coming up with this vaccine technology. So then why wasn't this done earlier? Well, actually it was. It was tested in mice since the 1990s. One of the challenges with this is that it's hard to keep the mRNA stable. So what scientists did is they packaged the virus in these lipid nanoparticles, which is a fancy word for fat droplets. So they're in these fat droplets so that when they enter, they don't get dissolved. And then other ingredients are acidity regulators, salts, sucrose, which is sugar, and water. I gave you all the fancy terms last week. So this is all the, the basic terms. That's all that's in them. So other myths I hear are there microchips? What else goes in it? That's really it. And then the other concern is what happens to this mRNA? Well, actually, the mRNA comes and does its thing, and it has something called a cytoplasmic tail. So actually a tail. So when the vaccine when it's done, it actually erases itself. It becomes cellular debris and just goes away. So the mRNA is gone. So why did we then do this sooner? Another reason is because pharmaceutical companies, they didn't have a reason either. Like there were many vaccines out there. This was a new technology. Who knew how it would take off? But now's the time, and here we are, and here we have it, right? So that is a brief description of mRNA vaccines. So was the process rushed? What happened then? The process was not rushed. So these mRNA technologies, again, they've been around since the 1990s. When China, the first public cases of COVID-19 happened in December 2019 from China. By January, China had shared the genetic information with the world so that we can work on making these genetic sequences. So then there were resources around the world. So there's academia, there's governmental agencies, there's nonprofits, then there are pharmaceutical companies. All these resources put all their efforts into making this vaccine. Then, as I just explained, the actual method itself of the mRNA vaccines is quicker. So that was a benefit too. Social media got thousands of volunteers to come sign up for these trials. COVID was rampant and contagious and widespread. So easy to test efficacy, easy to see, hey, did it work or not? And then finally, the pharmaceutical companies, they invested all their efforts into prioritizing the pandemic. So that's how it happened faster. So now, what is an emergency use authorization? An emergency use authorization is a way to make it possible to use a drug or a vaccine that is not fully approved in an emergency setting. So what has to happen to get us there? So I've explained how we make the mRNA vaccine. So first, there's something called a phase 1 trial. So that takes like 10 to 90 patients, and what it does, and these patients are usually healthy, and it tests the vaccine and says, is this safe? Is this safe? Are there significant side effects? Can we actually do this? That's phase 1. And then if there are actually really bad side effects, then you don't go to a phase 2 trial. So then you get to phase 2, and that takes hundreds of volunteers. And that really looks at what dose do we use? It looks at kind of the details. So then you go from phase 2 to phase 3. And so phase 3 looks at thousands of volunteers. It looks at thousands of volunteers, and then it looks for safety and efficacy again. And these are usually, phase 3 usually take like, they're not just done over and done in a couple months. Actually, they keep going for years. And so Pfizer and Moderna were able to get like in the order of 40,000 of volunteers. And not only that, they broke it down. So you can't just test a vaccine in one population. You can't say, does it work in, Caucasian women only? You have to get different demographics, different countries, and you have to publish all that as well. So then what does an EUA mean? An EUA means you have to have gotten to phase 3. So you have to have done the type of studies that require hundreds of thousands of volunteers, and you have to have at least 2 months of safety data, which means that after someone got the vaccine, the second vaccine, you have to have studied them for 2 months. So Pfizer and Moderna, they both did that, and they took that safety data. So they took their phase 1, phase 2, and an interim analysis, a part of their phase 3, to the FDA and got approval. So that means that in the first 2 months after the vaccine, there were no significant side effects. So is that number important? And that number is very important, because what scientists and researchers do is they study vaccines. And so there's a history of vaccines. So I know in my head which vaccines have come and gone. So for example, the oral polio vaccine, we don't use that in this country, or we don't use that anymore, right? And then the swine flu vaccine. All of these vaccines, so, the polio caused paralysis, the swine flu vaccine, it caused something called Guillain-Barré. Then we have just no side effects that are very significant. So the yellow fever caused some side effects, some spinal swelling in infants. The MMR causes something called thrombocytopenia, which lowers your platelet count. All of these side effects happen in the first 2 months. So there's not a vaccine in history where I can say, I point to that, and that vaccine, man, 3 years after it came out, scientists are saying it was bad. All of the vaccines that have been pulled for the market or have warnings happened with side effects, had those side effects happen within 2 months' time. So then it's super important that these EUAs looked at 2 months worth of this huge body of data. So that's an EUA. So what's happening now is that Pfizer and Moderna are applying for a biologics licensing application, which is a BLA, which actually usually they want 6 months of data. So they want 6 months of safety data instead of 2. And so that's the process that's happening now. And they've just applied in May and June. And what these BLAs are they're hundreds of pages of data that the scientists from the pharmaceutical companies have gathered. They include everything, like even adverse events that people don't think are significant, and even if they happened and they're not related to the vaccine, they're included in this huge application. And so they give that to the FDA, and the FDA looks at that. They have a time to interact. They do something called response to questions, and then they come out. And so it is an extremely long process that usually looks at 6 months of safety data. And then within, like, it's not just a pharmaceutical company and an FDA, right? So the pharmaceutical companies, they're required to have something called an independent monitoring committee, right? And so they get experts who are not associated with them, like from academia, from global organizations, to act as experts. So they have to have that. It's called an IDMC, an independent monitoring body. And then on top of that, the FDA collects a group of experts as well in a public forum, and those experts give advice to the FDA, and the FDA takes advice as well. So this is the process that we're in right now. So the idea that enough people weren't tested, that we didn't wait long enough, that that we didn't follow the process. It's actually, we followed everything. It just, the circumstances were right within COVID for us to actually produce an mRNA vaccine and then have enough data, 2 months, to get this emergency use, and now to hopefully very soon get the full approval. So that's my quick bit. And so I am open to any questions.
I love it. Thank you so much, Dr. K. That was awesome. I learned something from you every time we talk, so I appreciate it. So I am going to start with some questions that were submitted prior to the session, and then I will get into the questions in the chat. So if you all on the call today have a question, just go ahead and drop it in the chat. But we'll start with a question that was submitted this week. Can you please explain why we only know that the vaccine lasts for 6 months? Why are we encouraged to get a vaccine that may only be good for short term? And if you could talk a little bit about the variants as well, that would be helpful.
Sure. So what we have is 6 month efficacy data from Pfizer and Moderna, which is excellent, which is greater than 90% efficacy. So these studies, as I mentioned, the phase 3, they're still ongoing. So we'll get more and more data. So we don't know how long these antibodies will last and how long efficacy will be for these vaccines. But right now, you know, the scientific community is saying that these antibodies last certainly for a year. It is my personal thought, so this isn't FDA or anything, it is my personal thought that in the future, we may all be getting boosters for COVID vaccine, and they may become an annual vaccine, just like the flu vaccine. But why to take it is because people who get the vaccine, they don't get as severely ill, they don't get hospitalized. You can still transmit it, but the viral load in your nostrils is so much lower if you get the vaccine. So the vaccine still prevents you. So sure, you can get the vaccine and then you can get COVID, but then it'll just be like a cold and you'll be home for a few days, and you won't get sick and you won't require intubation and you won't be severely ill. So that's why to get it. Oh, and you talk about the variants.
So a little bit about the variants, yes. So we have the vaccine and now we have all these variants, you know, Delta variant right now, but more to come. So what does that mean for the vaccine?
So right now, all of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine are effective against the variants out there, including the highly transmissible Delta variant. The way there are parts on the spike protein that researchers have studied that they've looked at even the Delta variant, and they've seen that, you know, the vaccine should still work on the Delta variant. And then we have real life evidence. So like the Public Health Agency in England published data saying that they actually looked at numbers of people who have gotten the vaccine and looked and said there's 88% efficacy for Pfizer against the Delta variant. So sure, we are not done by any stretch of the imagination with variants. There will be many more variants of these COVID, right? But the vaccines now are very effective against them. And in the future, with such technologies that we have, they will continue to be effective against them. That's our hope, and that's what scientists are striving for.
Perfect. And I'll talk a little bit about your session last week. So last week, Dr. K hosted a session about why you should still get the vaccine, even if you've had a COVID infection. And I'll let you just give a brief kind of overview on that. And the link is available in this week's weekly WhatsApp email that went out yesterday. But that's kind of an important conversation around the variants as well.
Sure. Just to briefly say it, we don't know enough about the natural antibodies that you get after having COVID vaccine to say that they will definitively protect you. And we don't know how they'll do in the setting of these variants. We actually have that scientific lab data from vaccines being tested on variants. And then also we have, real life numbers efficacy data that these vaccines out there work against the variants, whereas our knowledge of natural immunity is so much less. For example, if you had a mild form of the disease, then do you have less antibody? We just don't know enough about the natural immunity. And actually, from last week to this week, there's been a new study published in the MMWR looking at patients in Kentucky showing that, the vaccine is that much more efficacious than natural antibody. So we're getting more and more data suggesting to us that it is better to get the vaccine and have an extra degree of protection. And if you do both, if you get if you get COVID and get the vaccine, you have something called hybrid immunity, which is actually the bestest of the best. So you will be very protected against COVID in the future.
Perfect. So you talked a little bit about this as well with the efficacy, but we did have a question submitted about which vaccine is best and what would your recommendation be for that?
Right. So between the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer and the Moderna, I would say get whatever you can get. both of their efficacy is so high within the 90th percentile that whatever you could have the opportunity to get, please go ahead and get. The viral ones like the J&J now, I would actually, the mRNAs are looking better in terms of the variant. So either the Pfizer or the Moderna would be good.
Perfect. We also had a question submitted about fertility. We had a whole talk, I think it was 2 weeks ago at this point, about fertility and the COVID-19 vaccine, a really important topic. I think we're going to have another one coming up as well. But again, it's a question that comes up every time. So I'd love, Dr. K, for you to speak on that a little bit. What do we know about the COVID-19 vaccine and fertility?
So we know we've given millions of the doses, and in the millions of doses that we've given, we haven't seen any effect on fertility, so much so that the main bodies that have to deal with OB/GYN, they've all went ahead and made public statements saying that getting the COVID vaccine will not affect fertility. And so I can tell you, since I did a whole, session, right, why people originally said that is they said that the spike protein might look like something on the placenta. And so maybe the antibodies on accident would fight the placenta. But scientists everywhere have come out and said, no, that's not true. They don't even look alike, right? So it's not like the antibodies are going to go ahead and target your placenta. They won't do that. Someone's even said it's like saying, a hunter's going to come and hunt two different animals and they're going to mistake a mouse for an elephant. They are not. If they're going after the elephant, they're going to find the elephant. They're not like the antibody, what's in the placenta, that placental protein looks quite different from the spike proteins. And so scientifically speaking, just because I gave that kind of a lecture today, there's no basis to this idea. And then in real world studies, like in the millions of people who've gotten the vaccine, there's no evidence that this is true.
Thank you. I love that explanation. Is the vaccine safe for individuals who have a family history of heart disease or an individual with an enlarged heart?
Yes. So actually, sometimes people who are healthy are a little bit more cavalier about their health, and people who have medical problems kind of ask me the questions. But it's actually like if you have heart disease, if you have heart conditions, you should absolutely get the vaccine, because what you have then is something called a comorbidity. And when you get COVID and you have comorbidities, sometimes it can be even worse. So you're actually in the group that should certainly be getting it. It is very, very safe if you have heart disease, lung disease, not even safe, indicated if you have heart disease, lung disease, immune deficiencies.
Perfect. Thank you. So we're asked this a lot too. Where can we find the information that you explained today? So this session will be recorded and it will be on YouTube. We'll share that with everyone who attended today, and we'll also share it in our weekly What's Up newsletter. It's an email that goes out on Wednesdays. But Dr. K, like if we're looking for resources online, studies, where do you go for information?
So the CDC, the NIH, there's a place called clinicaltrials.gov. All those give great information. And the studies that I mentioned, you can, like, there are studies that come out of certain institutions, and people might have a little more, like Hopkins, NIH, Harvard, they're publishing all their data, and they have websites as well that kind of publish vetted data. And so those would also be a good resource for you.
Perfect. Yes, finding that information is always helpful. Should we get tested to ensure that we don't have COVID before we get the vaccine?
That is actually a great question. So we are right now if you're asymptomatic, we don't test you, and you don't need to be tested per se. You can just come in and get the vaccine. So that's actually an excellent question, and I haven't even thought about that myself. But right now we don't have the resources to test everyone who's asymptomatic before they get the vaccine. And what's really, really important is getting the vaccine out there and making sure that you get the vaccine. A test would only perhaps hold you back at this point. If you haven't had an exposure to anyone with COVID and you're asymptomatic, just go ahead and get the vaccine.
Perfect. And back to the information question real quick. Thank you so much, Vicki, for putting in the chat. We have some great articles on COVID-19 and the vaccine at baptistjacks.com/juice. And there's a recent article that was just published about the vaccine and the FDA and emergency use authorization. And Dr. K served as our expert source on that. There's also articles about the fertility myths. So lots of good stuff on Juice out there as well. Next question, if you are immunosuppressed and you've had the vaccine, will the vaccine be effective against COVID?
So if you're immunosuppressed, so many trials are happening now to see if you are immunosuppressed, if you're developing antibodies. So this is what I have to say. If you're immunosuppressed, some of those individuals aren't developing antibodies like anyone else would. But there is another pathway called the T-cell pathway, which also gives some defenses. So please don't think it's pointless. It's definitely helped, even if you don't develop antibodies. So many clinical centers are actually testing this population, and this population will get sicker, if they get COVID. Many institutions are testing them. Like, for example, Hopkins has several trials in solid organ transplant recipients. And actually what these trials have been showing is that if you're immunosuppressed, that you may not be developing antibodies. And so the FDA and several scientists are actually meeting on Friday to discuss boosters in this population. And it's actually probably a few days away where the CDC will recommend boosters for immunosuppressed individuals in this country.
What's the current data on those currently diagnosed with COVID that have potentially already had it? Can you talk to us a little bit about breakthrough cases?
Or
I guess not breakthrough cases, sorry, not vaccine and then had COVID, but previous infection and had COVID again.
So it's very hard for us to get that exact number here, like for example, here in Baptist, but what we're seeing is like generally over 90% of individuals here who get COVID have not been vaccinated. What we're seeing kind of around the country is that reinfection rates are around 2%. So if you've had COVID and then you get COVID again, it's around 2% of the population. So, while that number is small, I still encourage you, because the percentage is small, but the numbers are still big when you look at a country. So that's why it's still important to get the vaccine. Also because we don't know what's coming in terms of future variants and whatnot. So it is true that reinfection rates in the country right now are low, that if you've had COVID, there is some protection there. And actually numbers are saying around like between 40 to 80% protection, but reinfection can still happen, which is why we still urge you to get the vaccine.
Perfect. So now at Baptist Health, the COVID vaccine is required by November 15th or a religious or medical exemption. What health problems exclude someone from getting the vaccine? You might not have the list right in front of you.
But that's okay. I can tell you so we haven't included pregnancy. So if you're pregnant, then that exempts you. The reason I'm struggling is, so I don't have the exact list, but the truth is there are very few medical reasons that would get you an exemption. I can't, so it just goes to show you, I can't, other than pregnancy, which actually it's been approved in pregnancy also, but we just left that as a separate category. There are very, very few medical contraindications. I can't even think of one. So certainly if you get one COVID vaccine and have a serious, severe side effect, then we wouldn't make you get number 2. But other than that, perhaps if you had a very significant side effect to something like the flu and an allergist said it's unsafe, but I really, there are very few medical contraindications to getting the COVID vaccine.
Perfect. Thank you. You've gotten some great questions. I can't believe it's already 12:28. Like I said, this time flies by. We had another question about if you recommend getting the vaccine if you're pregnant. So we have a whole talk on that. So there's more information there. I can send a link out to the person who asked that question. Can you talk a little bit about if you got the J&J vaccine, should you get the Moderna or Pfizer? This is a question that came up last week as well.
So technically right now, the CDC is saying that J&J should be enough. there are many experts calling on this to change, citing that mRNAs are better against variants. So I think we'll see more in the news, more upcoming about this exact question. As you know, my personal take is that it is, how about this? I hope that the CDC looks at recommending mRNAs, even if you've had J&J, because I think that that may be a good defense in the future. So it's my hope, my personal hope, that the CDC's recs will change.
Perfect. Is there anyone who's not able to type in the chat who wants to unmute and ask one or two of our final questions? Also, while you're unmuting, I will say we have some questions about the medical and religious exemptions for Baptist Health. There's a lot of great information on the exchange. So if you go to the homepage of the internet and click on COVID-19 Vaccine Info Hub, there's more information there as well, all the forms. So I would encourage you all to read there for all the great sources if you have questions about the exemptions. So anyone able to unmute and ask a question?
Leslie, while we wait, I guess I was emailed a question that does having COVID antibodies or having past COVID give you a medical exemption? And the answer to that is no, because as we talked about in the last session, it's still better to have that extra protection. So there wouldn't be a point to getting tested to show that you have antibodies, because that still wouldn't necessarily count as a medical exemption.
Okay, super helpful. Thank you. Okay, I'll go with this for the last question. How long after getting the vaccine should you wait to try to get pregnant?
So people who are in the process of trying to get pregnant, who are already pregnant, who just had a baby, they can all safely get the vaccine. So there would be no need to try to wait to get pregnant, after getting the vaccine. The vaccine is super safe, should have no effects on the baby, should have no effects on fertility, and in fact will only do good things because it will keep you healthy from the 50 or so long-term side effects that we've seen with COVID. So, and it'll keep you out of the hospital and safe. So you will actually be doing your future baby a very good service by getting the vaccine and then trying to get pregnant.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. K. I enjoyed being here with you today. We're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat as well. So again, thanks for joining us. For everyone on the call who's still looking for a COVID vaccine, we have some appointments coming up at Baptist Health that are on the exchange, and we're also sending out emails about those. You're also welcome to go to vaccines.gov and find a location near you, and then send a photo of your CDC vaccination card to employeehealth@bmcjax.com. So we'll be back next week. I'm not sure what day or time yet, but we'll send an email. But thank you, Dr. K. You are amazing. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Back at you. Thank you for organizing this and for being a perfect moderator.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We'll have another session soon.